This is Laura Adler. I am so excited to be sharing with you this afternoon or this morning. I guess it's the afternoon, no matter where you are. And want to say a big thank you to Fullscript for inviting me to come and teach to this practitioner audience. I have been teaching to practitioners for starting 9 years in 2020, and I am really thrilled to bring this topic of environmental chemicals, environmental toxic exposures into this community, because I think everybody here can recognize that this topic of environmental chemicals is becoming larger and larger and is going to be only getting bigger. It is an unavoidable aspect of what clients and patients are experiencing out in the world. And during this webinar, I'm really just going to focus in on this one slice of this pie, which is how some of these environmental chemicals are altering our hormones. They're messing with our hormone systems, the hormone systems obviously of the clients and patients that we see. And I know that you guys all know that hormones rule all. They regulate all of the things that are happening in our body. And when we have some havoc because of these external environmental chemicals, it can become a big problem. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a snapshot of who I am. For those of you that don't know me, I know that I do have a number of people that I do know who said they were going to be listening in today, but for those that don't, again, my name is Laura Adler. I'm an environmental toxins expert and educator. Over the last 8 years, I have worked with nearly 4,000 health practitioners, really across all modalities in this topic of everyday environmental toxin exposures: nutritionists, nurses, health coaches, PAs, naturopathic doctors, MDs, chiropractors, acupuncturists. It runs the gamut. And I think the reason for that is because more and more people are recognizing that these chemical exposures are impacting the clients and patients they see, regardless of why those people are coming to see them. In that time, I've worked with health practitioner students in over 26 countries around the world. Toxins is a global problem. It is absolutely not one that is specific to any specific country. These toxins are everywhere. My goal is always to merge the most current research in environmental health with practical and no-nonsense approaches so that practitioners can actually integrate these tools into their practices in ways that are easy for their clients and patients to implement, because as we all know, if it's not easy, no one is going to do it. Through this work, I combine environmental health education and business consulting. I've helped thousands of practitioners really elevate the skill set that they have. They get better results for their clients or patients and become sought out leaders in this growing, booming space of environmental health and the detoxification field. And this field is really, really growing. So 10 years ago, when I first stepped into this space, there were very few people that were publicly talking about environmental toxins and in general, let alone with the links to chronic diseases. And now it's a frequent topic of discussion. There's all kinds of summits on specific health issues relating to environmental toxicity, whether it's heavy metals or mold or EMF. All of these fall under that umbrella. And so, you know, the landscape of exposures has really dramatically changed over the last few decades, and the awareness over the last few years, the last decade alone, has also really changed. Now, I want to share something that I think a lot of people here listening probably know about to some degree. So in the nutrition space, I know that we often are like outraged when we hear that the average medical doctor receives only 19 to 21 hours of education on nutrition, despite the fact that we all know that nutrition plays like the most foundational role in getting and staying healthy. When it comes to environmental chemicals, that picture is even more bleak. So medical school curriculums offer an average of 7 hours of training in environmental medicine, if they offer any at all. And much of that education is focused on either occupational exposures or on diseases related to things like cigarette smoking. None of it is focused on the chronic day in, day out exposures that each and every one of us has and that our clients and patients are getting. An article published in 2011, this is from the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, said that although environmental factors contribute to more than 25% of all global disease, and toxic agents ranked 5th in underlying causes of US deaths in 2000, environmental medicine education is largely omitted in the continuum of US medical education. So it's a huge, huge problem. So my objectives for our time together today is first and foremost to give you a small piece of that education around environmental health that so many practitioners are lacking or not up to date on, probably because they're busy running their practices and don't have time to do this research. Big fan of kind of cutting to the chase and saving some time for you guys. So we're going to focus on the role that endocrine disrupting chemicals are playing in trashing our hormones and leaving people struggling with chronic diseases or chronic health issues. We're going to discuss the different ways that regulatory bodies define endocrine disruption and versus how some of other fields of science may define it. We're going to talk about why endocrine disrupting chemicals in particular really kind of make a mess out of the whole dose makes the poison conversation. We're going to talk about that quite a bit. And lastly, we'll talk about the top 10 endocrine disrupting chemicals that your clients and patients are exposed to, often daily. And we'll focus on some simple action steps that every client and patient can take to start reducing those exposures. My goal is always action, not overwhelm. So what we're covering in this webinar is actually one small sliver, one small component of one of the practitioner trainings that I run, that I have up on my website. It's called Talking Toxins. This is a 5-week course where we go in depth into the most toxic exposures, how these exposures are affecting your patients, and what steps they need to take to start dialing down that exposure. The goal here is to help you supercharge their results by addressing this major overlooked audio root cause of imbalance. And a lot of this presentation is actually pulled from that course. So I'd love to know in the question box, how many of you guys are seeing these kinds of conditions in your practice? So just like give me a yes if you guys are seeing, you know, brain fog and allergies, PCOS, insulin resistance, fertility issues, autoimmune issues. My hunch is that these are, yeah, everyone's like, yeah, pretty much all of these, yes. So, you know, this is, these are some of the most common health issues these days, common, but certainly not normal. And one thing that they do have in common is exposure to environmental chemicals and specifically endocrine disrupting chemicals. So exposure to environmental toxins is really the biggest missing piece of this whole conversation around health and wellness. Excuse me. And I think that this statement is going to be more and more true as we advance our understanding and as our awareness about the connections or interconnections between the environment and human body and human nutrition and human health optimization becomes more clear. Okay, so let's dive in. I always like to start diving into this conversation with a little bit of context. The context really helps us to understand the scope of the problem and how it relates to what's happening for us, for our clients and patients. So these figures are going to be a little bit different depending on if people are outside of the US. I think Fullscript is mostly in the US, so probably US and Canada, obviously. Can't forget our Canadian brothers to the north. But so these numbers are going to be a little bit different depending on where people are. But in the United States, there's approximately 84,000 chemicals that are registered for use. Now I have in parentheses there approximately 40,000 are actively being used. are in use. This is because the the EPA only now, recently, this number 40,000 came out earlier this year, did the very first analysis to see whether or not chemicals on their inventory, which is where the 84,000 comes from, were actually being used. And prior to earlier this year, when they did this analysis, they actually had no idea how many chemicals were even being used. And so even though there's 84,000 chemicals registered for use, there's approximately 40,000 actively in use. However, this number does not necessarily include all of the hundreds or thousands of pesticides and herbicides, because those are not regulated under the Toxic Substances Control Act, which is part of what oversees that registry. So a little bit of sidebar there. Out of these 84,000 chemicals, only about 200 of them have adequate safety data, and I should have put that in quotes. We will talk about why that's not necessarily, what we have is not necessarily actually adequate. It's not a representation that is actually a true safety representation. Prior to 2016, which is when our federal policy that regulates chemicals, the Toxic Substances Control Act, was updated in 2016 after 40 years of not being updated. So prior to 2016, there was absolutely no requirement that chemicals be tested for safety prior to going to market. This is still a huge, huge problem. In fact, earlier this week, here in the United States, we had some congressional testimony about the federal policy that regulates personal care products that has not been updated since 1938. So that policy has not been updated in 80 years. And this is big part of why we're seeing all of these chemicals of concern in our consumer products, and then therefore in people, because our laws are very, very outdated. So we do know that these chemicals are migrating from consumer products through the food that we eat and the water that we breathe into our bodies. CDC runs their ongoing biomonitoring studies. Typically that's done through NHANES. To date, they've measured more than 300 chemicals in the US population. The fourth report, which is, you see a screenshot of that here, is the most recent report, although there is a 2019 update to that. They have found pesticides, heavy metals, perfluorinated chemicals. These are the nonstick chemicals we're hearing a lot about lately. Flame retardant chemicals, jet fuel, that's perchlorate. We'll talk a little bit about that. Plastic compounds, like it really does. We are exposed to hundreds and hundreds of chemicals. Many of these chemicals were being exposed to in utero, unfortunately. This was the most famous study of this type. There have been a few smaller follow-ups, similar sized follow-up studies. This was a study done by the Environmental Working Group in 2009. They looked at the umbilical cord blood of 10 newborns, and they found 287 industrial pollutants, 187 carcinogens, 217 neurotoxins, and over 200 reproductive toxins. Now, interestingly, when you add those numbers up, they don't equal 287 because many of these chemicals are sort of playing double duty, meaning they can be a neurotoxin and a carcinogen at the same time. So that's why those numbers don't add up. So, you know, what this illustrates is that the chemicals that are in use are making their way from our environment into our bodies, where many are proving to be harmful. Now, obviously, just because a chemical is measured inside us doesn't automatically mean that it's harmful. But when we do look, we are finding that so many of them have this really powerful potential to impact our physiology in some significant way. And the reality is that we are being exposed, all of us, to these chemicals every single day just through living our normal everyday lives. They piggyback on our personal care products, our household cleaners, the food and water that we drink, the materials that we store our food in. They're on in the couches we sit on, the carpets under our feet. It seems like it's a very overwhelming topic to broach, and it certainly can be. Again, my goal is to give you guys the information that kind of tampers that or tempers that overwhelm and shifts your clients or patients into taking action around these exposures. So Our focus again is looking at specifically the endocrine disrupting chemicals. I'm not going to do a big deep dive here because I think you guys all know this. The endocrine system is made up of all of these glands. They produce more multiples, sometimes one or more hormones. Together, all of these glands and the hormones they produce regulate like just about every single body function, from fetal growth and development to puberty, metabolism, energy production, stress response, immune function, sleep, even our mood. Our hormones are communication messengers. That's the way that I like to describe it. They, along with our nervous system, they're the main communicators between all of our different systems in the body. And these endocrine glands send signals to our cells and our organs through the release of really minuscule amounts of hormones. So I like to say that our hormones communicate in whispers. They're very small. They're not shouting. You know, when we look at things like puberty or menopause, we're looking at these very tiny fluctuations in natural hormone levels that precipitate these big life-changing events. And so, you know, we know that these hormones communicate in whispers, in really, really quiet, small amounts. In fact, in the book Our Stolen Future by Pete Myers and Theo Colburn, they describe just how minuscule the amounts of hormones in the body are. They write, hormones are exceptionally potent chemicals that operate at concentrations so low that they can be measured only by the most sensitive analytical methods. When considering hormones, such as one of the estradiols, the most potent estrogen, forget parts per million or parts per billion. The concentrations are typically parts per trillion, 1,000 times lower than parts per billion. So these tiny levels of chemical messengers travel through our bloodstream until they reach their target receptor. Each receptor is really designed to only respond to a specific type of hormone designed for that receptor. So the endocrine system functions a little bit like lock and keys. It's a really basic example of what a hormone receptor, what a hormone looks like, and then a endocrine disrupting chemical that's actually going in and blocking the docking of our natural normal hormones in to those hormone receptors. And so we'll kind of come back to this concept over and over. So the National Institutes of Health defines endocrine disruption as chemicals that, or endocrine disruptors, as chemicals that may interfere with the body's endocrine system and produce adverse developmental, reproductive, neurological, and immune effects in both humans and wildlife. And it's really interesting when we have organizations like the NIH that have actually been spending a lot of time looking at the role of endocrine disrupting chemicals, but are getting a lot of pushback from other areas, either of the administration or of different areas of sciences, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So there are a number of different ways that endocrine disruptors kind of do their dirty work. These are the three primary ones. There are certainly other ones. One, they can mimic or partly mimic naturally occurring hormones in the body. I'll give you some examples of those in a second, like estrogens, androgens, thyroid hormones. These can inappropriately turn on or activate our hormone responses. So estrogen mimics like bisphenol or phthalates are a good example of that, and I'll talk about those too. Two, they can bind to a receptor and block hormones from binding. When this happens, the normal signal fails, the body doesn't respond as it should. Examples of chemicals that block or antagonize hormones are anti-estrogens and anti-androgens. An example of a chemical that acts as an anti-androgen are PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls. Or three, they can interfere or block with the way that natural hormones or their receptors are made or controlled, for example, by altering the way that they're metabolized in the liver. So this is what hormone mimics look like. At the top, we have a molecule of estradiol, and on the bottom, we have a molecule of diethylstilbestrol, or DES, a molecule of bisphenol A, and a molecule of one particular conager of a polychlorinated biphenyl, or PCB. All of these are endocrine disrupting. So, you can see that while their shapes are not identical, their shapes are in fact very similar. And this is how imposter hormones are able to sneak into those receptor slots and mimic or block the action of natural hormones in the body. Now, in many instances, these chemicals are not designed, they're not intentionally designed to be, for example, an estradiol mimic. It just happens that that seems to be the case. Interestingly, for those of you that especially work in women's health or preconception or pregnancy, you may all know the story of diethylstilbestrol. What many people do not know is that bisphenol A in particular, which is ubiquitous now, 93 to 95% of people have bisphenol metabolites in their urine, was actually in the running to be used as a pharmaceutical. And it was replaced with diethylstilbestrol because bisphenol A was found to be a little bit too weak for its intended effect. And so diethylstilbestrol won out, and then we ended up with some major health effects from women that were taking diethylstilbestrol during pregnancy. Okay, so the effects of exposures to endocrine disrupting chemicals can really vary dramatically depending on when someone is exposed. So this is a real shout out for anybody who is working in the preconception, prenatal space, because what the research shows is that it's those early fetal developments, that first trimester exposure, that really has the biggest effect on fetal development and on, as we can see on this slide, what will turn into adult disease. So this is referred to as the fetal basis of adult disease, or FEBAD. There's a tremendous amount of studies that are looking at how specifically endocrine disrupting chemicals are really setting the stage for chronic disease in adulthood. So I think a lot of times when people are talking about toxicity, they're thinking of acute toxicity, acute poisonings. That's not generally what we're seeing in this conversation of environmental health. We're seeing these really small exposures that are leading to very subtle changes or alterations in physiology and brain chemistry and hormone chemistry that can lead to chronic disease in adulthood. So a really important window is this window of preconception and early fetal development. So the real first evidence of that a synthetic chemical could disrupt the endocrine system in significant ways is this example of diethylstilbestrol. It was prescribed from the 1940s to the 1970s, depending on which country you're talking about, to prevent miscarriage. That was the belief anyway. In the early 1970s, it was reported that young girls who had been exposed to DES in utero had a higher likelihood of developing rare vaginal cancers. By 1975, it was actually pulled for use from pregnant women, with as many as 2 million people exposed both directly and while in utero. Now, the risk of developing vaginal cancer was a 40-fold increase if a woman was exposed to DES as a developing fetus. So it's a great idea, as you guys are working with patients, to do a really thorough intake and ask questions if people are presenting with these types of health conditions. Hey, what was your mother's life like? What did she take any medications while you were pregnant? She was pregnant with you, etc. The offspring of DES treated women are now referred to as DES daughters and DES sons. They both have their own set of health issues, things like endometriosis, fibroids, cancer, infertility. In men tends to be reproductive birth defects, so things like hypospadias, undescended testicles, etc. So there is also we're just kind of going to go through some of these big areas of research in endocrine disruption. So there's a large area of body of research investigating class of chemicals that have been dubbed obesogens. These are chemicals that can directly or indirectly increase obesity through the disruption of metabolic, hormonal, and developmental processes. These chemicals have the ability to alter fat cell development, they can alter metabolism, and they can promote fat retention. So for all of your clients and patients that are struggling with weight, even if that's not the primary thing that they're coming to see you for, being able to address these obesogenic chemicals is key. I put all of these PubMed ID screenshots on here so you guys can go check out these studies if you want to go look at them a little bit further. So the Endocrine Society's second scientific statement on endocrine disrupting chemicals stated that endocrine disrupting chemicals can act as obesogens, diabetogens, this is a new term referring to its propensity to trigger diabetes, and or cardiovascular disruptors. For obesogenic effects, endocrine disrupting chemicals act upon adipocytes and, excuse me, and the brain to induce obesity, which generates insulin resistance, glucose intolerance, and dyslipidemia, and greatly increases the susceptibility to type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So if you guys are working with any of these types of conditions, it is really important to start addressing these environmental exposures. Here we have, I don't know if you can see my cursor on the slide. Can you see my cursor? Is that good? Can you see that, Cam? Or not? I don't know. Anyway.
We can see it.
Okay, I just didn't know if you could actually see my mouse. Anyway, so here's DES, which we just talked about. We will talk about bisphenol A. TBT stands for tributyl tin. It's found in things like shower curtains, but is primarily used in marine paint. So it's, again, good idea to ask about occupational potential occupational exposures. Phthalates, DDT, PFOA, TB, BPA, and PCBs. So we're going to talk about some of those as we proceed. So this happens, this link between endocrine disruptors and this weight gain and dyslipidemia happens primarily, although not exclusively, through the activation of the receptor in the body called PPAR gamma, which is this master regulator of fat cell development. When it's activated, it can actually change the programming of our fat cells in ways that lead to increased fat and fat retention. So if a stem cell is activated, or if PPAR is activated in the presence of a stem cell, that stem cell will, instead of becoming a bone cell, for example, it will become a fat cell. And this actually leads to an increased number of fat cells in the body. For cells that are already fat cells in the presence of PPAR activation, that cell will actually increase its capacity for fat storage, so it literally just becomes larger and can store more fat within the cell. And so here we have an increased number of fat cells and an increased volume capacity for fat storage. This is weight gain happening on a cellular level that has nothing to do with diet or exercise. It's referred to as chemically induced weight gain. This is one of the biggest areas of research around these endocrine disrupting chemicals, because we have this massive epidemic of overweight and obesity, not just here in the United States, but everywhere. Activation of this receptor can happen at any point in life. It's not limited to prenatal period, for sure. So for example, we know that a lot of pharmaceuticals have a side effect of weight gain, and that's well established in the literature. People understand that. You go on an antidepressant, you can start putting on weight, and those chemicals, certainly not all of them, but many of those pharmaceuticals act on the same pathway, so they also activate that PPAR receptor. So certain endocrine disrupting chemicals like bisphenol A can also alter the hormones regulating our appetite or satiety or food preferences. They can alter our basal metabolic rate. They can alter energy balance in favor of storing calories. They can alter insulin sensitivity and fat metabolism in endocrine tissues. Bisphenol A, as you can see here, has been found to correlate in humans with altered levels of leptin and ghrelin. These are the hormones responsible for hunger and satiety. So you can start seeing that we have these compounding problem that these endocrine disruptors can cause weight gain on their own, but they can also alter our hormones that are responsible for telling us when to stop eating, which I think is really interesting and complex not to tease apart. There is a 2006 study published in the journal Environmental Health Perspectives here on the slide that showed that mice exposed to extremely low levels of bisphenol A, about 1,000-fold less than the levels that the EPA established as being the point at which there are no effects, so the EPA's low L, altered blood glucose levels and led to insulin resistance. Continued exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals can lead to this vicious cycle of weight gain. This is that compounding effect that I was talking about. This is a graphic from a 2017 study published in the journal Current Obesity Reports. The PubMed ID is on the bottom of the graphic if you guys want to look it up. The study authors wrote, "It is noteworthy that many endocrine disrupting chemicals are lipophilic, and POPs, or persistent organic pollutants, in particular are known to bioaccumulate in body fat over the years. It's therefore plausible that the link of obesity to disease relates not just simply to the deposition of fat, but to the increased retention of lipophilic pollutants in the greater volume of fat." So what they're saying here is that all of these correlations that we have in the literature about being overweight and developing chronic disease may actually be due to the fact that that weight is actually storing a toxic load, and it's the toxicity that is contributing to those diseases, not the fat in and of itself. Sidebar, I don't have a slide for this, but I think this really brings up an important point for those practitioners who are working with their clients or patients on fat loss. Fat loss mobilizes toxins, including ones that happen to be endocrine disrupting, if the liver and the other detox pathways are not functioning optimally. And I think we all know that most people don't have fully functional, fully optimized detox pathways, and in weight loss with these people may actually be retoxing them. This is why people often feel like garbage when they're doing a detox or a cleanse, or they start working out, because they're burning that fat and those toxins are all being mobilized. I think this is also important to consider for people that are moving to embracing things like intermittent fasting. I think intermittent fasting is wonderful and has a time and a place, but we also have to proceed with some caution if there are people that are dealing with a lot of stored toxicity, and I think that that's pretty much everyone. Okay, so more and more research is being done looking at the role that these chemicals, both endocrine disrupting and otherwise, but these ones are specifically the endocrine disruptors, in messing with our immune system in ways that can lead to the development of autoimmune disease, or at least contribute to autoimmune flares. Endocrine disrupting chemicals can interfere with the synthesis of cytokines. These are the proteins that help regulate the body's immune system, our immune response. People with autoimmune diseases, doesn't matter what kind, often have elevated levels of these cytokines in the body. And endocrine disrupting chemicals can lead to weakened immune systems, hyperactivity of the immune system, leading to autoimmune disease. Excellent book. It's a little old. It's about 10 years old at this point, but it's still an excellent read for those of you that do focus on autoimmunity. The Autoimmune Epidemic by Donna Jackson Nakazawa is a great read talking about the environmental link to these conditions. We also have phthalates. We'll talk a little bit more about phthalates in a few minutes. These are associated with several chronic inflammatory diseases, including asthma, and allergies in children. We know asthma is the leading cause of emergency room visits for children under 5 years old. So if anybody is working with that demographic in their audience, for certain, making sure that we're dealing with these environmental exposures is key. Phthalates, fragrances, again, are PAL, BPA. I'll add in there BPS and F. Triclosan, which is an antibacterial that is still found in a lot of consumer products, even though it was banned from hand soap a couple of years ago. Parabens and even UV filters found in sunscreens are all associated, they're all endocrine disrupting, they're all associated with asthma. I think we normally think of asthma and environmental exposures as being a respiratory a particulate matter, but that's not necessarily the case. These can be asthma triggers, even if they're not actively being inhaled and causing irritation in that manner. Endocrine disrupting chemicals are obviously, I think it's pretty clear that we can see why they would be linked to conditions like endometriosis and uterine fibroids. These are estrogen dependent disorders that, very often leave women with debilitating pelvic pain and struggling with infertility. Again, the Endocrine Society is basically saying the greatest risk factor here is exposure to unexposed estrogen, and so many of these environmental chemicals are estrogen mimics. So that's where we potentially have a role in this growing body of people that are dealing with estrogen dominance. It's certainly not the only factor, but it is a factor to consider. Now, at the moment, there's approximately 1,000 actual or suspected endocrine disrupting chemicals. These are the ones that the EPA's current criteria, that meet the EPA's current criteria for defining what an endocrine disruptor is, and that's its ability to bind only to estrogen, androgen, and thyroid hormones. We already know that hormone binding isn't the only mechanism, and we know that other hormones, just like leptin and ghrelin, can be directly affected. So clearly, the EPA's guidelines for defining what an endocrine disrupting chemical is missing a massive portion of the other mechanisms of action or the other ways in which endocrine disrupting or chemicals can be endocrine disrupting. So clearly this 1,000 that they've already recognized is just the tip of the iceberg. So I want to shift a little bit to talking about this idea that the dose makes the poison. So I would love to hear from you guys in the chat, like how many of you guys were taught that the dose makes the poison? You can just give me a yes in the chat if that is the case. This is what the entire field of toxicology rests upon, is this concept that the dose makes the poison. So when people say, oh, the amount of chemicals in our consumer products is so small, of course they're safe, there's really no big deal. Or this one, my favorite, even too much water can kill you if you have too much. It's the dose that makes the poison. Yes, interesting. So we've got, it's the buildup. It got some good comments in there. Yes, so this is actually one of the most frequently stated rebuttals to the idea that low levels of chemicals can have negative health effects. We often see the dose makes the poison statement in news articles and in statements made by chemical industry or consumer product companies as an attempt to shut down discussion about potential health effects of chemicals in consumer products. So I like to say that this phrase or this statement is true, but partial. It is absolutely true for some things, but it is not absolutely true. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this, and we're going to use this as an example. So this is a graphic that came from the American Chemistry Council, where they're saying BPA poses no health risk to consumers because current exposures to the chemicals are too low to cause harm. So we are going to come back, we're going to kind of tease that apart. So phrase dose makes the poison hails from Paracelsus, Swiss physician living in the 1500s, often referred to as the grandfather of toxicology. I just like to show this slide because I love his face and I love his amazing name, and I want somebody to bring this name back into the world. Philippus Aurelius Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheimborn. Took me a really long time to say that, and I don't even know if I'm saying that correctly, but anyway, that's just for funsies. So what he actually said is all things are poison and nothing is without poison, only the dose makes it that thing is no poison. So again, this statement is true but partial. So let's unpack that a little bit. So for many chemicals, In fact, I would say most chemical exposures that we get, and certainly, you know, for other things like radiation, not technically a chemical exposure, but an exposure nonetheless, that this statement is in fact true. So for most chemicals, the effect of the exposures do indeed follow the path that more exposure equals more effect and less exposure equals less effect. When we plot these on a graph, this is what they look like, either a negative or positive association. This is a linear dose response curve. It's referred to as a monotonic dose response curve. A good example of this, like I said, is radiation. Small amount of radiation we get from eating a banana, for example, not a big deal. High levels of radiation can be fatal. So when we, oops, looks like I bumped ahead. That's good. So when we plot a substance like radiation or an exposure like radiation, it kind of looks like this. This is the big takeaway here is that it is predictable. Goes straight up or straight down. It doesn't change. You know, if the entire field of toxicology is based on the assumption that all things follow this linear curve and that all things are follow this very predictable monotonic dose response curve with some variation. So it doesn't have to be a perfectly straight line, but generally speaking, this is the sort of the summary of it. For many exposures, you know, this certainly is true, but it's not true for everything. So if we look a little bit at the way toxicology approaches the testing of our substances, they are the ones that determine whether or not something is, quote, toxic or not toxic. That's what the field of toxicology is intended to do, as opposed to the field of pharmacology, which is sort of the same discipline, just a little bit further down on that dose response curve. So traditional toxicology testing, high doses of a substance are tested to obtain what's called the maximum tolerated dose. Then they're looking for the low L and the no L. The low L is the lowest point at which they start observing an adverse effect, i.e. it's the lowest amount that came with some adverse effect that they could identify. The no L is the first point at which they see no adverse effect. Now at this point, they put some safety factors in that are applied to reach what's called the reference dose. And i.e. this is the dose that they presume to be safe. Now, once that dose is established, research into exposures below that stops. Whatever reference dose is established is rarely tested directly. Research then just stops. So endocrine disrupting chemicals behave in ways that really fly in the face of this dose makes the poison. What we know is that tiny amounts of hormones can lead to profound effects on fetal and adolescent development and normal adult health. We now know that extremely low levels of exposure can readily disrupt the endocrine system, and that for some endocrine disrupting chemicals, they actually don't have an effect at high doses, the ones that are typically tested by toxicology, but they do at the low doses. So in order to make sense of kind of how endocrine disrupting chemicals can behave differently and have different types of dose response curves, it's helpful to kind of take a step back and say, like, well, wait a second, what do we actually mean here by low dose? Like, what does this mean? So the National Toxicology Program in 2001, I think, at the request of the EPA, pulled together a group of scientists to kind of answer this question, like, what is low dose? How do we define this? Because these words are being thrown around and there is not a single definition for what low dose means. So what they came up with was this. They defined low dose as any biological change, 1, occurring within the range of typical human exposures, 2, occurring at doses lower than those typically used in standard testing protocols, 3, a dose below the lowest dose at which a biological change or damage for a specific chemical has been measured in the past, i.e. any dose below the lowest observed effect level or lowest observed adverse effect level, which we just talked about, or 4, a dose administered to an animal that produces blood concentrations of that chemical in the range of what has been measured in the general population, i.e. not exposed occupationally, and often referred to as an environmentally relevant dose because it creates an internal dose relevant to concentrations of the chemical measured in humans. So in simple terms, what they're saying is that low doses are the levels that are below the low L that are commonly measured in people and that are not being examined by traditional toxicology. So, I mentioned in the very beginning that we have about 200 chemicals that have, quote, adequate safety data. But when we're looking at the methodology that they're using to come up with that, quote, safety designation, we're looking at these traditional toxicology tests that are ignoring what happens below the low L and the no L. So traditional toxicology is looking at these high doses. They're looking for overt symptoms of toxicity. So sudden weight loss, altered organ weight, organ shutdown, tumors, death. They're not looking for the slight alterations in immune function or weight gain or increased levels of thyroid hormones, loss of IQ points, etc. Thought this was an interesting quote to share. This was from a paper titled Hormones and Endocrine-Disrupting Chemicals, Low Dose Effects and Non-monotonic Dose Responses, published in Endocrine Reviews in 2012. And the authors state that low doses of a chemical could affect expression of a hormone receptor in the hypothalamus, an endpoint not examined in high-dose toxicology testing. And high doses could similarly affect this same endpoint, but are likely to be unreported because high doses are rarely tested for these types of endpoints. Thus, the presence of low dose effects makes no assumptions about what has been observed at higher concentrations. Therefore, low dose effects could be observed at the lower end of a monotonic or linear dose response curve. Okay, so we now know that low doses are important, or certainly can be important, and that our hormones are circulating at super low levels, and that pharmaceutical medications are dosed at similarly small levels. That's why they are functional and bioactive at these levels, because they're designed to do that. Let's take a look at how endocrine disrupting chemicals kind of fly in the face of that. So what we see with endocrine disrupting chemicals, certainly not all of them, so this is a very broad statement here, are that these dose response curves can be very different. What we can see instead are nonlinear or non-monotonic dose response curves that are varied and they are unpredictable. So what this shows us is that as a dose increases, the response can actually change direction. They're unpredictable. So a great example of that is pretty well established in the literature is the what's called the Tamoxifen Flare. So tamoxifen is a breast cancer drug. A subset of patients will experience this flare where their tumor growth actually increases before it ultimately starts to decrease. So we can see that that's taking on a little bit of a bell shape. A 2012 article in Nature explains it like this. Tamoxifen binds to estrogen receptors in breast cells and has a dose response curve shaped like an upside down U. Very low doses have little effect on cancer cells, but as the drug builds up in the breast tissue, it actually stimulates tumor growth, triggering a painful flare period for patients. When tamoxifen levels grow high enough to occupy most of the available estrogen receptors, the effect reverses and the drug begins to inhibit the cancer cell's growth. Thomas Zeller, a researcher who has been studying endocrine disruptors at the University of Massachusetts, who made that statement about tamoxifen, also said, all of this is very well known to endocrinologists. Non-monotonic dose response is a fact of life. So for anybody here who works in the endocrinology field, you guys all know that. This is a fact of life. Fred von Saal, who's professor of reproductive biology in the Division of Biological Sciences at University of Missouri in Columbia. He's probably the most published author on BPA, found more than 100 different studies on BPA that found significant effects below the low L, below that low L that's sort of established within the toxicological literature. So he said endocrine disruptors act in ways that are totally unpredicted by traditional approaches to toxicology. For example, here is another 2011 study. This is from Journal of Environmental Health Perspectives. Found that oral BPA exposure in rodents resulted in a non-monotonic dose response curve, and that higher effects were seen at levels far below what the EPA considers safe. So you can see here, this is the dose, at least in humans. This is obviously a mouse study, but this is the dose that EPA considers safe, and this is the dose that actually had the highest effect. So it was much less than that. This one is actually interesting. This is a human study. We don't get very many of these in environmental medicine because of ethical reasons, obviously. But these researchers actually wanted to test this theory of what the EPA level of exposure to BPA was that's safe. They said it's 50 micrograms per kilogram of body weight. And so they dosed human beings with that, quote, safe level, and found that it altered insulin sensitivity in humans. And I believe that that was after just 1 day of exposure. So a big deal. So the bottom line is that toxicology, or our traditional toxicology, tends to, at least when it comes to these low dose environmental exposures, they tend to ignore what's happening on this other side of the dose response curve and are assuming that everything kind of follows this somewhat linear path, and then they're just going to stop doing research here, and they're not investigating what's happening on this side of the line. So again, if we go back to this, BPA poses no health risk, because the current exposures is too low to cause harm. We know that the level that's already deemed safe, and that's, you know, with those factors of safety built in, altered insulin response in human beings. So, you know, when it comes to endocrine disrupting chemicals, the dose does not always make the poison. Does not always make the poison. So where are we being exposed? Where are your clients and patients being exposed? I want to spend a couple minutes on this slide talking through. So, you know, bisphenols, I'm not putting BPA here because the alternative chemicals, BPS and BPF, research is showing they are just as bad, if not worse. 90% plus of people have metabolites of bisphenol A in their bodies. It's linked to everything from weight gain and obesity to insulin resistance, cancers, irritable bowel disease like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. BPA-free is not necessarily better. We have phthalates. Over 95% of people have metabolites of these chemicals in their urine. They're found in thousands of consumer products and are also linked to a long list of health issues, including decreases in IQ, language delays in children, fertility issues in both men and women, thyroid dysfunction, flame retardants. Flame retardants are a really big one. Most flame retardants are either they're all halogenated, so they're the brominated or chlorinated, which means that they are targets for our thyroid. Any of the chemicals that fall into the classification of the halogen have the ability to displace iodine in the thyroid, leading to thyroid dysfunction, which can downstream lead to a giantly long list of health conditions, many of which your patients are probably dealing with. We have perfluorinated chemicals. These are found in nonstick coatings and grease-proof surfaces and food packaging. They're found in raincoats, you know, camping gear, popcorn bags, dental floss. It's also a widespread contaminant in drinking water. If you are, for those that are watching live, you should all go out and see Dark Waters, which is a film that portrays a lawyer named Robert Bilott, who spent 20 years suing DuPont over the contamination of the drinking water with perfluorinated chemicals. The Dark Waters is a theatrical representation of that sort of legal drama. Sort of our decades Erin Brockovich is what people are calling it. We have our organophosphate pesticides. These often are endocrine disrupting and are linked to a wide variety of health issues, including things like gut dysbiosis, and are primarily found on the conventional fruits and vegetables and animal foods that people are consuming. PCBs and dioxins are another endocrine disruptor that we mostly encounter through animal foods. So for people that are increasing animal food intake because they're doing a ketogenic diet or even a carnivore diet, I think we really need to be very mindful with those types of patients because unfortunately PCBs and dioxins have a very long half-life. Atrazine is one of them, a very widely used herbicide. It's found in 94% of drinking water samples tested by the USDA. Perchlorate, which is a component of jet fuel. A lot of people are finding that their clients have high levels of perchlorate. They might live near an airport or a military base. Similarly, perchlorate as a chlorinated compound is a halogen and therefore can affect thyroid function. And lead and mercury, a lot of times we think of lead and mercury and heavy metals as being neurotoxins, but they are also metalloestrogens, a classification for metals that have estrogenic properties and endocrine disrupting properties. So, this is sort of what we're faced with at any single given day. Your client or patient can encounter all of these chemicals. There absolutely is a cumulative effect, or cocktail effect is what it's called, when it comes to endocrine disruption. It's a very hard field to study, but there is some research that's showing that 1 + 1 does not equal 2. 1 + 1 might equal 5. So the amplification of endocrine alterations in the presence of more than one endocrine disrupting chemical is probably what's happening here. So I don't know why I have a blank slide in there. So, your goal as clinicians is to help clients and patients systematically reduce exposures to endocrine disrupting and other chemicals. My goal is to help you learn how to systematically guide each and every client and patient in this process of systematically dialing down exposures to environmental toxins, doesn't matter what kind. And avoidance here is key. So most practitioners love to jump to detoxification and or supplementation, both things that are very obviously important, and they absolutely have their time and place. But what we must educate patients on is where they can start dialing down those exposures that are keeping them sick and struggling. So if you're working with people that have hormonal imbalances, fatigue, inflammation, autoimmune, gut issues, allergies, brain fog, fertility issues, on and on and on and on, it's really critical that you also start addressing these chronic everyday exposures to environmental toxins. And if you're not doing that, you are missing a huge piece of the puzzle and a huge opportunity to really help transform the health of your clients. Now, Dr. Walter Crinian, for those of you that are in the environmental medicine space at all, or in the naturopathic medicine field, know Dr. Walter Crinian. He passed away earlier this year. He's a leading voice in this field of environmental medicine. And he had this kind of tongue-in-cheek way of presenting how critically important avoidance is. So he mapped that these are his 5 steps to addressing toxicity, and it's avoidance, 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 then supplementation, and then detoxification. But what does it mean to have avoidance, right? Like, it's not enough, certainly we can't just tell our patients, like, go avoid these exposures, because they don't really know how to navigate this. They don't know where they're being exposed. They don't know whether or not it's actually meaningful to their health. And they certainly struggle with finding the alternative products or behaviors that can help them reduce those exposures. So as practitioners, as clinicians, we need to guide them on how they do that. So we can't just say, for example, like, go do an elimination diet and then not give them the tools and resources they need to be successful in that. And that's my goal, is to give you guys the tools to do that. This is what we do inside the 5-week practitioner course called Talking Toxins. It's there to help you help your patients identify what to avoid. You guys already are like fully on board with supplementation. You're part of the Fullscript family, so I know that you know that. And I know that you guys are already on board with detoxification, but without focusing on avoidance, supplementation and detoxification will not always get you as far as you need to go to really help your client or patient reach that health goal that they're striving for. So I just want to share a little bit about this course and what some of my other students have said. So my current student, Karen Shoshana, said the information in this course is hugely important to those of us in the field who are working with those with compromised health. It's a bit of a disservice to counsel others on how healthy existence and not provide consideration for these elements that are embedded in our cultural experience. And it feels like this information should be part and parcel of any solid counseling nutrition program. And frankly, in retrospect, I am surprised it isn't. So I'm going to go for another couple minutes, and I just want to let everybody know we are going to open for Q&A. So I just want to wrap this up. I know you guys are all busy. I'll skip through. Here is my client, Sonia Madera, an MD, says that if you want to expand your knowledge base and provide better, more complete services, you've got to get informed about everyday toxicities that are affecting health. So this is just a snapshot of what you'll be able to do. I think you guys will have access to the replay of this, so you can go over these later. I don't want to get into all of them, but the big point here is that you will be able to easily provide your clients with the education and resources to identify and eliminate these overlooked environmental toxins that are preventing your audience, your practitioner, your patients from getting well. The goal here is to supercharge the results that you're getting for your clients. Very few practitioners really dive deep enough into this topic. I think that's a really big missed opportunity and a mistake in how we work with our audience. Like I said in the beginning, this is only going to become a bigger topic. You will be able to eliminate hundreds of hours of self-study, research, and resource creation. There's over 1,000 hours of research went into the production of this course. Because I know you guys are busy, you don't have to do that. So for those of you who are my logistical people out there, I'm a logistics person. I like to see what's what. This is how Talking Toxins course works out. It is a 5-module, 5-week course. There are over 28 lessons. It's over 10 hours of content. Everything is fully cited. There are hundreds of citations for you to go through. There's practitioner talking points. We have a whole series of white labeled client facing handouts that you can stick your logo on and share directly with your clients that guide them through, safer cookware, safer seafood, and how to start navigating this in real time for them. Consumers are certainly becoming more and more aware of these issues. Articles are talking about these connections all the time. They don't have practitioners to turn to for answers. So if you guys are seeing any of these things in your practice, right, this is what we showed this earlier, these are the kind of health issues that are being impacted by environmental chemicals, and being able to address this topic and go deep, much deeper than most are currently able to do, I think is really, really important. So I wanted to share and extend an invitation to come and join me in this course. You can enroll at lauraadler.com/talkingtoxins. As a thank you guys for being here, as a thank you to Fullscript for hosting me. I have set up a promo code, which is just Fullscript, where you can save an extra $250 off the current sale price of this course, which is a killer deal. As I said earlier, most medical school curriculums only offer an average of 7 hours of education. This course at 10 hours is already surpassing that. So it is a incredible opportunity to really elevate your skill set and your fluency in this topic. So, we can certainly open for Q&A, and if you guys have questions about anything that I've covered in this webinar, I'm happy to answer those. You can kind of drop those. I don't know if you want to queue those up. And I don't know if I can, I think I have to expand the box in order to see them fully. How do I see the questions fully, Cam? Because the box is really small for me.
Hey, Lara, how about
Yes.
I collect the questions and I'll send them to you via email, and then we can get to those afterwards. And then
Okay.
keep taking people's too much.
Yes, I don't, yeah, I mean, like, I'm happy to stick around and answer questions if people have them. but I don't know if you have to jump off and if that's going to bump us off the platform.
Oh no, I can stick around here. I'm just trying to go through these questions here, and there's quite a few.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I mean, let's see. Right, okay, so Annika had a question about, for cooking, what is your take on hard anodized steel baking pans and pots? So it's a really great question. I actually have a whole lesson inside the Talking Toxins course on cookware, but I'll give you the sort of Reader's Digest version. Hard anodized steel is, generally speaking, a good surface to cook on. The problem is that hard anodized is becoming much harder and harder to find. For some reason, the companies like Calphalon that used to make hard anodized steel cookware aren't really making them anymore, or they're hard anodizing the outside, but the interiors almost always still have non-stick coatings, which are not ideal. So people really have to do a lot of digging to find actual true hard anodized. I don't know why it's fallen out of favor. A alternative that I like that still falls into the category of lightweight is certainly going to be stainless steel, but carbon steel is, it sort of behaves in the way that cast iron does, but it's a lot lighter weight and is doesn't have those health issues that nonstick would. There's some considerations for people using things like carbon steel or cast iron. For example, if they have hemochromatosis, they won't be able to handle the iron in that. So hopefully that helps answer your question. All right, let's see. Okay, great. So Janine asked, what's your opinion on nickel and stainless steel? Janine, do you mean in cookware? I'm gonna guess I'll answer that question based on the assumption that you're talking about cookware. So, you know, stainless steel cookware does have the potential to leach both nickel and chromium in very small amounts. Generally speaking, this seems to not be a problem for most people. What I have read is that the leaching of those chemicals really only happens in the early stages of getting like new cookware, but after you've used it for a while, that tends to decrease. So, you know, it's obviously for people who have issues with nickel or chromium already, I encourage people to use either glass or enameled cast iron. The enamel is like a glass-like surface. So these are really great granular questions. Some of which are addressed inside the Talking Toxins course, because we go through all of these topics of cookware and food packaging and pesticides. And so you'll have a lot of those questions answered in there. Let's see. So many toxins are in our water. So Annie Pico asked a question, so many toxins are in our water. Absolutely. Do you have a favorite shower filter for those of us who live in a town with chlorinated and fluorinated water? So short answer is that I don't have a favorite, because most shower filters are actually all the same. There's really only two types of filter media that can tolerate high temperatures and fast water flow. So there's not a lot of variety in the marketplace. Most of them will have KDF and activated charcoal, and that's it. I do actually have a whole separate course on water contamination and filtration, because it's quite complicated of a topic. Let's see. Somebody was asking about chemtrails. That's definitely not an area of expertise. Some great comments in here. Let's see if there's any other questions. Yes, and Janine wrote, the solution to pollution is dilution. That's certainly that. All right. Okay, let's see. I think that might be most of the questions. I think, yeah, let's make sure that any other questions that people have, Cam, you can email those in. I want to be really respectful of people's times, because I know you guys are all really busy. And people can shoot me direct questions if they have any. But I do hope that, excuse me, I do hope that this is helpful and it helps to contextualize the scale of the problem around environmental toxins and why it's really important for practitioners to really start elevating their skill set and being able to address the everyday exposures that people are getting. Yes, we certainly know that when people are coming in with occupational exposures, there's a different protocol, but when we're looking at lifestyle medicine and lifestyle modification, there's so much powerful work that can be done here to help ease the burden on the body from these exposures. So I do hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to seeing any questions that you guys have, and hopefully seeing some of you guys in my class to dive a little bit deeper. So thank you. Thanks, Cameron, and thank you to Fullscript, and thanks everyone for sticking around.